Hello everybody, welcome. Thank you for coming. My name is Sarah Flank. I am an adjunct professor in the Department of Philosophy as well as a research associate at the Institute for Criminal Justice Ethics. We're really happy to have you here for our event on veterans and the long shadow of PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder. Just to give you a little bit of an idea of the format of the event, I'm going to introduce our panelists when they are going to speak. I'd like to thank them for coming and welcome them. This is Colin Reef, Judge Marsha and Dr. Marino from the Psychology Department. I'll tell you a bit more about each of them as they come up. They're each going to speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a question and answer period at the end. So please do feel free to ask questions at the end of any of the panelists. So very briefly, I'm going to tell you just a touch of the background of post-traumatic stress disorder in case there are any attendees here who are not totally familiar with what it is. So post-traumatic stress disorder is a psychiatric diagnosis. Technically, it is in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, and it has been there since 1980. It's a bit controversial sometimes to call it a mental disorder. Certainly a lot of veterans have different feelings about that. This can be quite an emotional topic, and I'd like to encourage all of us to be considerate of the opinions and the views of everyone here. So it is, excuse me, I'm sorry, I have a cold. Like I said, it's been a diagnosis since 1980. It is one of the few diagnoses that had a veteran advocate on the work group. So it's a diagnosis that is linked to veterans, but since then it's certainly become a very fast-growing diagnosis for all kinds of different traumas, including abuse, terrorism, all sorts of things. So without any further ado, let me introduce Colin Reef. Colin Reef is a licensed clinical social worker, also a master's student here at John Jay, and most importantly, he is a veteran himself and a veteran mentor for our John Jay Veterans Association here on campus. That group does have an office and a lounge area over in North Hall on the 3rd floor in room 3140. Colin is also the Director of Veteran Services for Reality House. He works with vets experiencing difficulties with trauma and substance abuse. And during his time as a non-commissioned officer in the U.S. Army, he served as a squad leader for the Division Cavalry Reconnaissance Troop of the 82nd Airborne in the Army. So, Colin.
How is everyone today? So again, my name is Colin Reef. I'm the Director of Veteran Services for Reality House. And I just want to take a little bit of time just to talk about some of the work that I do with veterans through a number of different projects. And then also just discuss PTSD and sort of what it as a subject has done to veterans communities, how it's affected us not just as a disorder, but also as a social subject, and how that's sort of changed a lot of how veterans are perceived, how they behave around each other, because it really has had a kind of big impact. So I've been, through the work that I've done, through a number of different projects, I've worked with a number of different, I guess, levels of post-traumatic stress. Through Reality House, where we're basically an outpatient substance abuse program, does what's called trauma-informed care, where we treat substance abuse disorders. There's a very large correlation between post-traumatic stress and substance abuse, and traditionally, the way that it was treated, substance abuse was treated, would actually kind of exacerbate post-traumatic stress symptoms and vice versa. So we do work basically where we do treatment around sort of post-traumatic stress disorder. We don't get into exploring stressors, more teaching people how to manage their symptoms better, and also learn better, I guess, coping skills, better ways to sort of self-soothe, to take care of themselves. And the idea is either to help some, for some people that's, the primary intervention, they're good to go, or it helps people get into a better position where they might be able to move on to a larger mental health intervention. So at the other end of the spectrum, I also do it's a veterans outreach program where we try to identify veterans amongst the homeless population that comes into a food program and do assessment referral. And there you're dealing with, unlike most of the people we see at Reality House, within several months you can start to see massive improvements in quality of life. There you're dealing with people who oftentimes there's comorbidity with some other major mental illness, schizophrenia, homelessness, incredible poverty. There's just a number of issues facing these people. Are oftentimes too disorganized to get into treatment or even into shelters. So it can be a much longer haul to try to sort of, start moving these folks up the ladder to they're really capable of really good independent living. And really what we do there is assessment referral and trying to connect them to, agencies that really have the technical skills and the infrastructure to really help them. And then at the exact opposite end of the spectrum, I'm also a peer mentor with the John Jay Student Veterans Association here. And what we see there is much more, with a few exceptions, these are people who really, they don't have any symptoms of post-traumatic stress. These are, by and large, the 70% of combat veterans that really aren't going to be facing any type of issues. And I guess we sort of view it as resiliency prevention. I think in many ways the best prevention towards people having symptoms is really having a great life, getting excited about academic materials, making friends who you can be, interested in what's going on in their lives and having a great prospect for a future. So through that, what we do is a lot of just kind of connecting each other and helping each other connect to GI Bill, different types of services that can really help sort of smooth people through the transition from the military to college and then on to having a great career afterwards. So, most of the work that I've done over the last several years has really been centered around working with veterans, and obviously you're not going to work on veterans without running into a lot of post-traumatic stress. Now, the way the DSM defines post-traumatic stress, in a nutshell, it basically implies that it's fear-based, that someone experienced a terrifying event, something that usually it was described as something that was happening to them. And they'll develop symptoms in 3 areas. That's hyperarousal, avoidance, and re-experience. And the re-experience might be intrusive thoughts, it might be nightmares. The avoidance strategies are people trying to avoid the stressors, and oftentimes their world gets smaller and smaller as they, there's less and less they can do because they're always afraid that there's something that's going to trigger these very unpleasant symptoms. So some of the things that we've come to realize, one, the epidemiology in the United States for this particular disorder is profound. I think it's 9.8% of women throughout lifetime will experience clinically significant post-traumatic stress. So, this is a very common diagnosis. But one of the things when we're working with trauma clients that we've come to notice is that there's a lot of holes in this, that this really isn't necessarily an accurate picture of what's going on as it's defined in the DSM. We know that the age that the stressor happened can be a big thing. Someone who experienced childhood abuse might have different symptoms than someone who was in an industrial accident as an adult. Whether it was a prolonged stress or something that was repeated, or whether it was a one-time event. These can be things that will really dramatically affect how the symptoms kind of come out. So a lot of us in the field have really started to look at this and become very concerned that this label we're using is somehow inaccurate or not really helping us in setting up saying, hey, this is a cluster of symptoms that someone has that can be dealt with this way. So what have we learned in the last couple of years? There's been so much research around this, and entirely different perspectives have kind of come about. And so one is on the other sort of the biological. A lot of veterans sort of view this, and I personally view it as more a neurological injury. We know that the neurology of post-traumatic stress is understood so much better. We know that the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system are basically fighting each other at an incredibly hard rate. The hormones that cause the parasympathetic nervous system to sort of kick in are, I think I forget the exact number, it's like 40 times higher amongst people who've been through major trauma. And you wind up with people who have these 2 nervous systems sort of in a state of dysregulation because they're working so hard against each other, like sort of 2 engines with a gas sort of stomped on it, working against each other. And on the sort of when we look at it as a psychological condition, we're seeing different clusters of symptoms, like I said, based on age, based on whether it was a prolonged stressor, based on a number of different things. And some of the things we tend to notice is it's not always fear-based. It's not always about something, it's sometimes about something that happened to someone else. Sometimes it's about regret, remorse, loss of a friend, not having done enough for someone else, the trauma of having killed another human being. And a lot of people are starting to refer to this as moral injury. In trauma circles, they also throw around the term DESNOS, or disorders of extreme stress not otherwise specified, where you're seeing additional clusters of symptoms. And in the VA, they're just now starting to recognize this. And I think a lot of us who have been in the clinical field have been saying this for a while. And now you're starting to see some research start to catch up to it, where people are starting to look at it. And also on the social side, one of the things that they noticed about post-traumatic stress after Vietnam, they did studies on Native Americans who were considered to have higher incidences of post-traumatic stress, but had much better prognosis for recovery. And a lot of people were trying to figure out why that was. And what they realized is that most Native American cultures have what they call a welcoming home ceremony or an eagle feather ceremony. And some medical anthropologists started to realize, okay, what's the significance of this? And it was really about the leadership of the community taking on onus and responsibility for this person, for what happened to them, what they did, what their experience was like. And these people stood a much better chance. So what seems like this deeply personal psychological experience also has some social roots. So, you know, as it's defined in the DSM, I think that we're you know, in just a dot of ink in a sea as far as what this sort of encompasses, and we really don't have an entirely accurate understanding yet. And so then when we look at it that way, when we start to see what's missing, first of all, I think there's a number of factors that are really sort of missing from the how we as a culture and a community and a country are dealing with this. Comprehensively, how we deal with this prevention is near to non-existent. We don't have the safety nets. Oftentimes, particularly in behavioral health, like substance abuse where I work, it's when someone's been through the criminal justice system, once they're applying for public benefits, there's some sort of mandating source. So catching things before they're a problem really isn't something we really have the networks to do yet. And they're just now starting to understand resiliency, and resiliency is a big factor in this. One of the things we know about trauma is it actually behaves more like almost like a toxin than a disease, in the sense that, you know, you're exposed to something, you usually have an ability to process it out, but if that level goes up too much, you sort of lose the ability to process it. It becomes cumulative and continues to build. And as someone's resiliency will go down, the more trauma they're exposed to, which is kind of counterintuitive. You would think someone who had a tough life and they went into the military would have, you know, more resiliency to it, but actually it's going to be lower because the conditioning really isn't a factor. And then also I think with the social issues, the aftercare, the maintenance from treatment, and just the social stigma that a lot of people deal with. The social stigma is, and sort of social understanding is a big thing. You know, I think that one of the things that we're also, the diagnosis is sort of written as being binary. It's you have these symptoms or you don't, rather than looking at it as a gradient or spectrum of symptoms that may kind of come along. And that's one of the problems with when we try to label something or put it in a box. I think it's lost is the nuance in between, the sort of shades of gray are not always there. And so, you know, from a societal level, I think what we don't understand is that this is not always an entirely debilitating thing. There are plenty of people who have some element of post-traumatic stress, but function fine and have great lives and can do stuff. They may have some trouble sleeping every once in a while, but by and large they can't, to people whose lives have absolutely been, you know, brought to their knees by this. The stigma is another big factor, and I'm going to cover that a little bit more, but some of the things that, you know, particularly with veterans are facing, where there's just always an assumption that, well, they're a veteran, they must have problems. There may be sort of a concern. I think it's one of the reasons you see such low employment rates with veterans is employers, I think, are oftentimes afraid that, well, you know, they're going to act out in the office or become violent in the office or, you know, things along this kind of nature. And so the stigma can be a big thing, and it's one of the things that really creates a barrier to people going and receiving any type of help for this beforehand, so they don't wait until it is a crisis oftentimes. Even amongst veterans themselves, sometimes there's an attitude of hey, just pull it together, you know, and sort of not really paying attention to the fact that there are some people who need help and some people who don't. So I guess when we look at how this sort of plays out, one of the things we see is, first of all, we know that 70% of combat veterans are really going to go through life with really, you know, nothing significant as far as combat trauma goes. So the vast majority will have the ability to sort of move on from the experience on their own. And they're tremendously affected by this as a giant subject. First of all, I think, like I said, oftentimes there's an assumption that any veteran has post-traumatic stress. Many veterans are not in combat. Many served in support roles. Many served in times of peace. Any number of things. Many who actually were in combat, it's just not an issue for. But there's always this assumption that, well, they're a veteran, there might be something off. I think oftentimes when you walk into any, you know, any type of healthcare thing, when you're going through your screening, the second you know, click veteran, it immediately goes into a post-traumatic stress screening, a TBI screening, and a lot of the things that the population is at risk for, they should be screening for, but it's almost an assumption. And then I think, you know, sometimes programs and their sort of their own zeal to want to help people overdiagnose, or they're almost pushing to get someone to sort of divulge that they have these symptoms. So veterans are also constantly pressured by non-veterans. There's always this sense that when you're a veteran, people want to either label you as a hero, as a victim, as a monster, as, you know, something like that. And there's always people that sort of want to put their meaning of what being a veteran is on it. And it's really, in my opinion, something that should really be left up to the individual, not something that people should be telling you. And so what comes with this and this stigma and this barrier and this kind of sense that other people are sort of interpreting your experience for you, is this stigma, which really prevents a lot of people that could probably benefit from some sort of resiliency counseling. And if we think about it, you don't need psychopathology for resiliency counseling. Who here couldn't benefit from more relaxation techniques, better coping skills, just learning how to have a healthier life? But oftentimes there's such a fear amongst veterans that, well, if I go do this, they're going to think that I have PTSD. I'm going to wind up with this, tag that's going to follow me around for life. It's going to affect my employment abilities. If you want to become a first responder and you have this diagnosis, forget it. You're done. Your career's over before it started. Also, like I said, it's also just assumed that veterans have PTSD. Certainly any type of behavior that other people deem off, they might just think is automatically post-traumatic stress. I was a sergeant in the Army. Being a little grouchy sometimes is not out of character for me or whatever. People just assume, oh, it's PTSD, be careful, Please, don't stress him out. And so oftentimes, anything that's just a behavior that seems sort of direct or overly aggressive, anything like that, oftentimes people will just assume it's PTSD. Oftentimes getting upset about things anyone would get upset about. Well, it must be post-traumatic stress. So this really, like I said, I think this is one of the things that really affects hiring. I think it affects how people are handled through the healthcare system. And in a sense, what we've done is we've almost pathologized being a veteran, and being a military service has almost become its own sort of clinical disorder through the larger perception of society in a lot of ways that, I think that it's well intended. I think that people really want to get out there and help veterans and, sort of see this as a population. And I do think that, we as a society do not just owe veterans some degree of loyalty, but I would hope that we were all a little bit invested in each other's well-being and care. But oftentimes in people's sort of zeal to do that, there's just this automatic sense of like, oh, you poor wounded little thing, let me try to help you. And it can really put people off, and it can also sort of isolate people. They may not want to be around it. So this also causes a big rift amongst veterans themselves, amongst the 70% that are going to be all right, that aren't really going to have, suffer any clinically significant symptoms. And the 30% that do, oftentimes that 70% is a little leery of the people who are having problems, because they don't want the stigma of the problem vet sort of to wash up on them. They don't want to just automatically be associated. I was on the subway a few days back, and I saw an elderly veteran who seemed to be having some issues, and I just walked and was just talking to him. And after he got off the subway, a number of other people came over to me, and they're like, that was really nice. Are you okay? And I'm like, yeah, but I mean, what in my behavior made you think that I was in crisis? So I think that if we were able to diminish that stigma, that 70% could be a much higher number. That if people really had access to the things that sort of prevented, just remember, post-traumatic stress disorder is a disorder that happens sometimes long after the actual stressor. And a lot can happen in between then, and the things that do happen in between the stressor and when the symptoms come up oftentimes are what bring on the symptoms. And I just through the work I've done, I've personally come to believe that we as a society are responsible for post-traumatic stress as combat is, or trauma itself, just in our reaction to it. And so when we look at the 30% that are affected, that are really, suffering severe symptoms of this and are really having their lives affected by it, I think sometimes they're often marginalized by other veterans in the sense of there's always a fear of like, hey, what's the matter? You couldn't just pull it together, and they don't want to be perceived as weak or not being able to handle their business in front of other veterans. And if you think about it, who would be a more natural ally to sort of, help someone off their knees and help them connect to resources than another veteran? So this rift really does affect the way veterans sort of interact with each other. They're often, like I said, afraid to seek help because there is a fear that they'll be perceived as weak, or they don't want to be the guy who couldn't handle it amongst their peers. And military culture is a very proud culture. It's very much you take care of your own business and you make sure you can stand on your own 2 feet kind of environment. And this really does kind of transfer over into when people are veterans, post-military. I think also that the veterans that are really suffering symptoms, they oftentimes become frustrated with the lack of clinical understanding. Like I said, our understanding of this diagnosis is actually pretty murky in the end. I think oftentimes there's a sense that the person they're talking to does not understand what's going on with them, really doesn't, sort of adding meaning to it. Well, were you afraid? No, I just felt awful that this happened to my friend. Were you afraid? No, I wish that I could have done more for someone. And also just the lack of clinical gains. I think that we are getting better in our ability to, as far as interventions go, we're getting, the interventions are becoming more and more effective, but I still think we have a long, long way to go before we can really effectively deal with this. And I think that a lot of the reasons our interventions aren't as effective as they could be is because there is a lack of understanding of how trauma sort of behaves and how it sort of, travels through someone's life. And also with that 30%, I think that, you know, they now need to deal not only with just the psychopathology and the symptoms and these things that are affecting them, now they're also deal with the social stigma being a problem vet, you know, sort of the guy in the subway with the hat with too many pins on it who's, you know, just seems sort of off. So they're becoming more and more socially isolated from people, you know, the very resources that they need around, the people that they really need to kind of help carry them through these sort of moments. And the other area where I think it's really affecting us is just doing the kind of work that I do in you know, clinical work. I think it's really affected the way clinical and human services behave in general. Veterans are a big business right now. There's a lot of grants flying around. We're the population du jour. And I'm always leery of what happens to any group once you become a population. It's a very disempowering thing to just sort of be shoved into a box. And you know, I think oftentimes once you're a population, there's also all these experts that show up. And think about what that does to your ability to self-advocate when you have, you know, 8 million people that think think they know better what you need in your life than you do. So, you know, and one of the things I've seen is a lot of people that are coming out of clinical programs in school, they're getting into the field, and you know, they've spent a lot of money developing a set of expertise in something. They're getting out there and they're realizing they're not really experts, and they're, you know, oftentimes a little like, I have no idea how to deal with this. But you know, at the same time, they just spent a lot of money on the degrees. It's not like they're just going to stop and say, you know what, maybe I'll go into become a stockbroker or something. So in a lot of ways, they're kind of fighting to do this. As you have these experts sort of appearing, you see this diminishment of things that really work, like peer support. Peer support is a big thing. One of the things that now that they're looking at, sort of, we were talking about moral injury or something, some of the interventions that they're teaching clinical psychologists and stuff to do involve psychodrama, sort of role-playing, who'd be the person that would give someone they would have the authority to tell someone they could forgive themselves for something. Well, this is what peer support groups sort of do intuitively. You know, if someone's telling me, hey, I was in this bad situation, all these horrible things happened, you know, a peer support group amongst other veterans would just say, it sounds like a bad situation where there's no right decision. We would say that, and we would automatically have the authority because we're a peer, we're another veteran. We could say, you know, hey, if I was in this situation, I don't know that I could have done better. And I think that is this kind of trend towards experts in the clinical field kind of comes in, and not that they're not needed, not that you know, we don't need people who, I think, you know, the research and a lot of the clinical interventions that come out of this, but you know, let's never take a group's voice away, that a group should have some ability to mend itself, you know, a population, that they should have some sort of say in what's going on with the larger dialogue around this. You know, I think that it can be incredibly disempowering to people that can happen. And so I guess what I'm sort of left with after this, I'm always sort of outspoken and kind of critical how we as a society have dealt with this, because I'm always left with the sense that, you know, if we're creating rifts in veterans communities, we're promoting social problems for people that don't even have symptoms, we're creating barriers to treatment for people with symptoms, and we're doing it on this sort of murky diagnosis that we know isn't quite on the spot. I mean, how good of a job are we doing? You know, I mean, what letter grade would you give us? A C+? C-? I mean, I think that we could be doing a lot better, and I think we need to do a lot better. So I just want to thank everyone for coming out and listening, because I think that this is something that we need to be talking about a lot more, and it's just something that we as a society need to be looking at. So thank you all very much.
Thank you, Colin. So a couple of numbers I did want to give, and I'm going to give them now. Our two most recent conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan have been fought by roughly 1% of our U.S. population, which is a very, very, very small number. So, but we do have a very large student veteran population here at John Jay. Estimates are about 650, right? That we have about 650 student vets. And for those of you who are either active duty or veterans, thank you for your service and thank you for being here. And
can we see how many in the room we have?
Sure. Raise your hand if you are
veterans.
Have served veterans.
Great.
Thank you. Okay, so now we're going to have Judge Marsha Hirsch. She presides over the Veterans Treatment Court in Queens County. She is also an acting Supreme Court Justice and Judge of the Court of Claims. She actually presides over 5 different problem-solving courts in Queens, including Drug Court and Mental Health Court. Veterans Treatment Court is her most recent. It opened in December of 2010, and now she's got about 35 or 40 veterans that she's working with. Some have also graduated, so I'll let her speak a little bit about that. This is Colin brought up the idea of studying these different issues. This is an area ripe for study, and it's also a very conflicted issue to be a studied population. So I really appreciate both of them participating and giving some of those different perspectives. So Judge Marsha Hirsch.
Thank you. Thanks so much for inviting me today. It's always a pleasure to come here and speak with people who are as interested in our treatment courts, including Veterans Court, as I am. As Sarah indicated, I preside over 5 treatment courts right now. All of them are felony level, so it would be felony drug treatment court, DWI treatment court, a mental health court, my veterans court, and a drug diversion court for the Rockefeller drug law people who have substantial criminal histories and are being given another opportunity at treatment. A few years ago, our team put together a trauma grant proposal to BJA, and we received a grant for just under $1 million for our court and 3 treatment providers to provide trauma-informed care and services across all 5 of my courts, which does include the Veterans Court. I agree with many of the things that Colin spoke about, and I think I really appreciate the fact that you emphasize the veterans who have returned and who have developed coping mechanisms and resiliency and are able to kind of, as we say, build the bridge and walk over it. And that's a great thing. However, I deal with the veterans who are in crisis. I deal with the people who've gotten arrested. And these are felony crimes that I'm dealing with here. I'm not dealing with petty misdemeanors on the panhandler on the street or whatever. I'm dealing with felony cases, and some of them are pretty serious. The crimes usually break down into 4 main categories, one being drugs, either possession or sale, DWIs, criminal possession of a weapon. As you know, if we all lived in Texas or in Georgia, there wouldn't be any problem whatsoever. However, in New York, some of my veterans have been arrested in Kennedy and LaGuardia airports for carrying guns through airports. So we have those issues to deal with. And the 4th are assaults, and they kind of fall in 2 categories too. One is the typical barroom brawl type of situation, where there's an altercation and the person gets arrested, or then they spill over into domestic violence type of situations, partner violence, or those types of crimes. So my veterans have to be 18 years of age, U.S. citizens, must have served in a branch of the U.S. military, and they have to be referred. Now, one of the problems that we have with working with our population is that some of our veterans don't readily identify as veterans. There's some shame, there's some guilt involved when people are arrested with crimes, and they oftentimes will not identify. Many times their own lawyers will not know that they're a veteran, and we may get a call from a family member or a close friend who may have read about our program or seen some news story on us and wanting their family member or friend to get the services that we provide. Also, some veterans, as far as getting treatment for addiction, whether that be addictions to alcohol, to drugs, both legal and illegal. We know that there have been a lot of stories written in the papers lately about very heavy criticism against the Veterans Administration because the doctors there are very, very willing to write prescriptions for addictive pain medications. And not saying that they may not be required. However, there seems to be a lot less talk therapy and working through issues than these veterans really need. So I know that talk about areas ripe for study, I think that's one big one right now. What kind of medications, what kind of care are people getting? Because I have to tell you, a lot of my veterans come home very addicted to Oxy, to Vicodin, and where do they go from there? Usually they're very good at being able to get their Vicodin and Oxy or Percocets or whatever drug they're taking. However, sometimes, unfortunately, in the opiate family, it becomes very, very easy to slide into heroin. I have a fair number of heroin addicts who've come recently home from Iraq and Afghanistan. I also have some of the Vietnam veteran guys who've been addicted to heroin for many years. Now these guys are pretty much in their 60s, approaching 70, and have been dealing with their own demons and issues. And you know what? They didn't get the welcome home and the great job and the thank you for serving that our newer veterans are getting. So some of them, and we see it in our treatment program, some of them have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder because they perceive that the younger veterans are better regarded and are better treated than they were. And some of them harbor a lot of deep-seated resentment, and probably correctly so. I have 3 women veterans in my court. It took the first year. We didn't get any the first year, but then I got 3 really, really quickly. All DWI cases. Driving, and a couple of them, no, one of them was driving with the child in the car, a Leandra's Law violation case as well. The interesting thing that connected them is they also all experienced military sexual trauma. 2 of them were raped twice while they were in the military, and 1 of them was raped once. So in addition to dealing with, and all of them served in Iraq and Afghanistan, and a couple of them had multiple tours. And unfortunately, when they came home, they had to deal with what they saw there, as well as military sexual trauma. So fortunately, we were able to connect them with treatment providers who could address those issues. And I think I graduated the last one 2 weeks ago. They've all graduated successfully now. And one of them is going to have another baby very shortly, very, very happy. The other one was actually in the Guard and is still in the Guard and serves. And she was called up to work during Hurricane Sandy, or Superstorm Sandy, whatever we're calling it. Another thing that I like to emphasize that people don't usually talk about is that trauma and PTSD isn't always something that happened way back in your past. It can be something that happens to you now. It can be a long-term ongoing situation, like something with domestic abuse, or maybe someone's lived with it for many years. This came home very clearly with one of my Vietnam vets who, it was right around the 10th anniversary of 9/11, and he came into court, and my courts are very conversational. I know a lot about the people who appear before me. So we were chatting, as we always do on the record, and I said, "How are you doing, Mr. So-and-so?" And he said, I had a major breakthrough this week, Judge." And I said, "Well, tell me about it." And he said, "You know, I came to realize something really important to my recovery, and this is a heroin addict." I said, "And what was that?" He said, "You know how they've been showing on TV the collapse of the towers over and over again, and those of you who were here around the 10-year anniversary can remember those images." He says, "You know, I lost a sister in tower number 1, and every time I watch those towers fall, I feel the loss of my sister again and again and again." And that's impacted me far more than anything going back to my Vietnam era days. So he made a major breakthrough. We were able to get him the additional, talk therapy that he needed, support groups or whatever. But he was finally able to make this connection with something that was seriously impacting his use of drugs and his recovery at this point. The other thing that some of my veterans that are pending with cases right now, I'm in Queens, so we had a lot of people in Howard Beach, in Breezy Point. If you just lost absolutely everything in your life that was contained in your apartment, and it wasn't a great apartment because it was usually a basement apartment, and guess what? Those flooded first. They lost every photograph, they lost every piece of identification that they had, all of their memories, anything that their families may have left them through the years. So talk about trauma, talk about dealing with any post-traumatic stress disorder you may have, plus add on to that a layer of addiction, because a lot of them do abuse drugs and or alcohol as a coping mechanism to self-medicate. And now add on that level of having just lost everything in your life. I know there have been a lot of studies done on the Katrina victims. I don't know of any, but that's another area ripe for study right now, and I can't tell you the number of people in my court that still aren't back in their homes in Queens. Sarah asked me to look at the numbers with respect to my population. And the average age of my population is about 35 to 40, and it's my Vietnam era guys who bring that age up. And we still do have, as I said, a fair number of those. We do screen for trauma. We use 5 different screening tools. We use the impact of event scale, the PTSD, PCL civilian scale, trauma screen, the trauma history inventory, the combat exposure scale, and the adverse childhood events, the ACE, to screen for trauma. The ACE is pretty interesting. The ACE is, you can just go online, that one is in the public domain. ACE just asks 10 questions going back to your childhood. And there has been a very interesting study done on the ACE with men who were enlisting, just men, who were enlisting in the Army several years ago. And I don't know the name of the study, but it shouldn't be that hard to find. But it indicates that of the young men enlisting, 70% of them had already experienced significant trauma, meaning 3 or 4 on the scale of 10, before they even walked into the recruiter's office. So just think about that for a minute. If people who are going into the military, and as Sarah points out, it's an all-volunteer service these days, if these people are going into the military and have already experienced trauma in their lives, what's going to happen when they face combat situations or get deployed? Are they going to get better or are they going to get worse? As Colin points out, we know when they come out that 30% of them, that's pretty much what our numbers show, 30% of them do have serious PTSD. So we can only assume that some of them, that a fair number, the majority of them who go in actually get better, for lack of a better word, or actually develop the resiliency that you spoke about. There has been a little research on that, and I know there's more ongoing, but my own personal theory on that is I think that it's, in some cases, we know about the adolescent brain maturing, and the adolescent brain doesn't fully mature until closer to 25 than 18. So I think in some cases where people are enlisting at 18 and 19, I think they're growing up in the military. So we can watch and study that as well. With respect to my veterans, 85% do have PTSD. So we do connect them with services there. Let's see what else I wanted to definitely tell you here. Oh, Colin mentioned about how our veterans return, and the fact that nowadays, I've heard veterans from different eras, from the World War II era, from the Korea era, from the Vietnam era. There's been a change with how a veteran gets discharged and comes home. Nowadays, it's very quick. They can be on a plane, they can be given their orders, and within 24 hours, they can leave, Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever, and they're home. There's no transition, and then they answer questions when they leave, but they answer questions that they don't have any problems, they don't want to talk to anybody, they don't need to talk to anybody because they want to see their families. They don't want to answer any question the wrong way where it's going to delay their coming home to their families. So what they've been finding is that the old troopship model, when your veterans left World War II or Korea, or I guess some even in Vietnam, it took them almost a couple weeks to get home. And they were with their buddies. They were with other service members, and they kind of decompressed. They kind of did that support group thing while they were all together on the ship coming home. And we don't have that now. And I think that could also lead to part of the adjustment issues that you see. And we see that when people get arrested really quickly when they come home. Thank you. I'm happy to answer questions afterwards, but I want to give the professor time to talk about PTSD.
Thank you, Judge. One of the unique features of Veterans Treatment Courts, by the way, is a mentor, a veteran mentor. Everybody who is a participant in any of the Veterans Treatment Courts in New York State, of which there are 12 currently, there's a veteran mentor assigned, and in fact, they're always looking for mentors, so if there are any veterans in the audience right now who are interested, that would be something we could possibly speak to the judge about after, or speak to me. You know, I have the ways.
I'll get you the application.
Great.
And you can give out the application, and then we'd go back to Patrick on my team.
Great, perfect. And lastly, Dr. Maureen Allwood is in our psychology department here at John Jay. She has interests in children and adolescents' emotional, behavioral, and physiological responses to trauma and violence, including PTSD and delinquency issues. So she's going to sort of riff off of all the themes that we've talked about here and speak about some of the developmental issues that can lead to post-traumatic stress later in life.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks for having this event. I appreciated everything that's been shared so far. In terms of, so title, professor, academic, an academic, but I'm also a clinical psychologist. I was trained at the Boston VA. I was in the women's division for a while, so I'll bring that. I thought I would stick closely to talking about, the controversy among veterans and bring into that some conversation about their family members. I was also, for some time, a military spouse. So I lived in Fort Bragg. I lived on the base in Fort Lewis, so I can bring that kind of family focus as well to our conversation here. So the controversy about PTSD, it's been, ongoing. This is one of our newest diagnoses in the DSM, coming in 1980. And this question about injury, we recognize this psychological injury and the need to, have a way of providing services to those who, we can't, see a physical injury, a physical response. So if we can diagnose flat feet, we can diagnose bad back, and we can say there should be, recognition of that and service and care for that, we need a way to be able to address the psychological impact of war on the veterans, and PTSD offers that. It might not be a perfect way of doing that. In terms of controversy, think about working with children, and many times the traumas that they experience, they didn't enlist, they didn't provide a service. It's something that occurred to them, that happened to them. So child maltreatment, for example, we see rates of PTSD, but we're saying to the child, you get a mental health diagnosis for something that someone else has done to you. So again, lots of controversy about this diagnosis and when it should be diagnosed. Working with the international population, I worked quite a bit with with people post the Bosnian War, so Bosnia and Herzegovina. So, people used to come in and train with us, and one of the concerns they had is how can you give an individual diagnosis for something that's a community problem? So there's a war, there's something that happens to the community, there's disaster, and you're telling me individually, I have a mental health disorder, but it's something that's really impacting everyone around me. So lots of controversies around PTSD, but we have this tension about, how do we provide care, how do we address health and strength and well-being at the same time that we say, we see some concerns, we see service. Now we're saying that sort of more broadly, not just for the veterans themselves, but for their family members, for their children, the impact, around the community as a whole. So I really appreciate the comments that Colin had to say about veterans, but it is this ongoing tension. And as well as, addressing PTSD among veterans, we know that PTSD exists, broadly. So for the general population in the U.S., about 80% will say that they have endorsed that they have experienced a trauma at some time in their lifetime. So the National Comorbidity Study, looking at just population epidemiological studies, about 80%. The early studies for OIF, specifically looking at Iraq, talked about 80, 90%. We know that's increased because many people have multiple tours. 37% at least have had at least 2 tours of duty in OEF or OIF arenas. PTSD itself is, as Colin pointed out, the physiological aspects, the catecholamines, the neurotransmitters, all the things that happen in the body, but it also affects, social functioning, emotional functioning, behavioral functioning, as the judge sees in court, cross domains, family life, occupation, educational aspirations can be impacted. So, it's, you know, it's definitely, although a new disorder, and I use that very loosely, but injury, recognizing this injury, we have to recognize sort of how it proliferates. One of the things I tend to say about PTSD is that there really is no such thing as just PTSD. For most people, PTSD comes with other aspects. You know, so it's a highly comorbid disorder. Some of the studies say maybe 7% of those with PTSD might not have something else going on as well. So PTSD is highly comorbid with depression, you know, other anxiety disorders, panic, you know, generalized anxiety. It's comorbid with substance use concerns. So in terms of looking at what I call like the heterogeneity of PTSD, and PTSD can present so many different ways in so many different people. You know, we wouldn't expect, given we're talking about 17 symptoms, they have to come together in this particularly kind of formation in order to get a diagnosis, but not everyone have the same symptoms along the spectrum, so we have to consider it sort of, you know, dimensional, kind of the spectrum. And some people look at this in terms of PTSD with externalizing features. So PTSD, the people who might be having issues with substance use, they might be aggressive, they might be acting out in ways that might bring them to the attention of the courts. There's also people with PTSD who we can describe as more maybe depressed, less likely to act out. I heard someone in Canada describe it as, you know, those veterans that may kind of live between the paint and the wall. You know, they're kind of very much maybe avoidant, withdrawn until something happens, and we might have more concerns with outbursts, but not everyone have an acting out concern. There's so many different ways that PTSD presents itself. In terms of prevalence, you know, we've heard that 30%. I think most studies show maybe a little bit lower than that. So the vast majority of veterans are not diagnosed with PTSD. They don't meet criteria. They're, you know, there might be other things going on, but it's not post-traumatic stress disorder. We know that traumatic brain injury, you know, TBI, has been, you know, featured highly in terms of the returning veterans now, because I think 22% of all injuries, combat injuries, are considered traumatic brain injury. So they're the polytrauma treatment centers that are identified to treat people with TBIs and other injuries. The suicide rates have made the papers quite a bit. You know, early on, I want to say 2008, I might be a year off, $60 million was offered by the Army to provide, you know, to do research, conduct research, and figure out what's going on. We had that 1 month in June where we had more casualty from suicide than we had from casualties of war. And last July, again, you know, we saw an extended period of time where we had more casualties from suicide among veterans than we had casualties in that same period in the war. So there's, you know, definitely a look at, again, the tension of, you know, most people are doing well, but what can we do for those who are in psychological distress? And what should we be doing? You know, the research that you mentioned is being an important factor, but also services, you know, informed services, informed trauma-informed care. One of the things that the VA specifically have been looking at, just kind of family factors. How does family figure in? So for the first time, we have reservists and National Guards who did not intend to be deployed these long periods in multiple deployments. So the time away from their family isn't planned in the same way that it might have been for, you know, other people who expected long tours of duty. So the family factor, being away from their family. Many service members are two-parent service members, so then making arrangements for their children, who's going to be a guardian, who's going to care for their kids while they're away. I worked in the women's division and saw women coming back. I was there in 2004, so there were people, you know, the early returns from OEF, Operation Enduring Freedom, Operation Iraqi Freedom. The early returns, there were issues of, you know, I just got back today, and I need to take care of my children. You know, my mom was the guardian. My mom is now done because I've gotten back, and now I need to take care of everything. I need to go back to my job, and I need to take care of everything. For women who were reservists, who didn't have the intention of being gone from their families for these extended period of time. And not also, you know, the issue about recognition for their service. Many of the women I worked with, they were the drivers in the convoys. They were in front. I worked with women who were injured, and they were still this notion of you're not on the front lines, you're not, you're not a combat veteran, you're just a female driver, was a big issue for many of the women that I saw. In terms of the impact going both ways, recognizing that PTSD and some of the other injuries that we talk about impact the family, so the family impact might have maybe some susceptibility for symptoms, but also the symptoms impact the family, so higher rates of domestic violence within families. Veterans with PTSD versus those without PTSD are twice as likely to divorce. They're more likely to have multiple divorce. So definitely impact on the relationships themselves that they form. And in terms of the parental relationships, sort of alluded to it, but the time away and the time return and the impact on their children and in the relationship and those bonds that people try really hard to form early on, and returning to their families with some of the experiences and not knowing what to share. There's that concern about oversharing and saying too much about the military experience, and that can have issues with secondary traumatic stress. So kids are now hearing about things that are graphic and detailed about war, and do you share that, and how do you return to sort of child-friendly environment after being in an adult-only environment for an extended period? And then there's the issue of undersharing. I'm not sure, do I just stay silent? Do I detach, disengage, withdraw? And trying to find that balance that's healthy for family life. And that's some of the struggle that veterans talk about. Not just female veterans, I mind you, male veterans as well, have this struggle about what can I share and how do I share it, and will it be accepted and how will I be viewed. Some of the things that's happening at the VA, that's happened in the last couple of years, is one is the Caregivers Act. So in 2010, the VA, the government, I should say, recognized that families need support, and they put money towards the research as well as the care that family members need. So families can go to the VA, and not just this idea of individual treatment. They can be in couples treatment, which has been there all along, but it's been expanded. But can also be individual treatment for family members. Children can be seen at the VA. I worked with someone who brought a pet in when they came in because they need a transitional object as they were driving 2 hours to get to veteran administration to get their care, and feeling all of the anxiety and concern that comes with the symptoms that they had. So I think there's more recognition that it has to go beyond the veteran themselves in order to provide the support and care that they need. Other things that are happening, I think, is working more closely with the veteran centers. So there's been this divide for a long time between the VA and the veteran centers, and the veteran centers were developed after Vietnam, with Vietnam veterans saying we don't even trust the government in ways that, for them to provide our care, so we're setting up our own centers for care. And I see more crossover, more conversation between them, calling and making appointments and saying, if you don't come here, go somewhere. So, and then we've talked about the veterans treatment centers, the polytrauma rehabilitation centers. So there's effort to sort of broaden that network. I think it's come a long way from the days when I was a military spouse, where the idea of family was, not GI, but does it matter? If it's not government issued, we don't care. And that was the role that families played, that spouse and children played with the military at that time, was we didn't give you a wife, we didn't give you a child, and we're not, yes, you have to leave, but we're not really providing care for them. And that notion has changed. I think that's where we have to move, even further towards making sure that changes. I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Hi. I only briefly heard Dr. Hirsch mention women that have experienced sexual assault in the military, and I feel like this is such an underserved part of the military. And I'm wondering if anyone has seen the documentary Invisible War, and what your thoughts are on how we treat women veterans.
I've seen parts of it. They showed a big segment of it on Katie Couric's show the other week, and they had the actual women and their spouses there to talk about their experiences. And it's a horrific problem. It's widespread. But I do think that there's hope. I think the military and the Pentagon itself is becoming very, very aware of the issue, thanks to the press and the documentary that you mentioned, and they are providing more training, and they're actually, I understand they're actually bringing charges against the perpetrators, and that's something that has not been done in the past. So you need these brave women to come forward, and I understand that they are actually going to be taking these cases forward for full adjudication. There aren't separate groups for women veterans within the VA. They're in the same talk therapy groups as the male veterans. And I think that that would be, I don't know that I necessarily would be so forthcoming with my feelings and my experiences if I were in a mixed group, as opposed to if I were in, but I understand that other VAs around the country, they separate those groups out. So we have to do a lot more. You're right.
Also, just to add that in the nonprofit world, you're seeing a lot of the same situations where, because of funding, a while back they were looking at female-specific programs, and a lot of them didn't really get their start. It's only been in the last couple of years that you've seen the funding come out for nonprofits and community providers to really start addressing separate issues. The community residence we were building at Reality House was originally intended to be for female veterans, and the state said, no, the population won't be there. And then, a few months after we started, all of a sudden they started to see the population and started kind of loosening up some of the funding for it. So it is something that we've been slow to respond to.
I would just mention that Boston has, they have a women's division, and I can't imagine that service that's happening for women there not being available for women throughout the VA. MST, military sexual trauma, is in most of the charts of the women who come in for service. And this is whether they're newly returning or they are from the Vietnam era or before that. It's just a long history of not being able to report, and the harassment, not just so we talked about the direct sexual victimization, but the sexual harassment that women report, not being able to address issues such as, an example, being told that they would be outed as lesbian if they don't comply, and then that would get them kicked out. So the jeopardy of their position in their job based on, lots of harassment. Most women I work with have a story around harassment, if not direct assault.
There's also thought now that in light of the fact that women will be allowed to serve in combat, even though we know that they've certainly been awfully close to it in the past, you're going to see a lot more women generals. A lot of positions women were not allowed to advance to because they did not hold combat positions. So now that that barrier is broken down, they're hopeful that if there are more women in leadership positions, you will see less of this sanction and less of the old boys network. But I also want to point out that military sexual trauma, men in the military suffer from that as well. So it's a two-way street.
Good afternoon. Another Fort Bragg alumni. My question is to kind of the direction that treatment is going. I know a few days ago I saw a post on the Facebook page run by my old unit in the 82nd, and it was about the VA sending out letters to veterans saying that they were found incompetent of running their own affairs, and that they had to turn in all their weapons, hire someone to take care of their financial needs out of their own pocket. And it was a lawyer who had a sanitized version with all the names taken out of the letters from the VA, but he was representing 4 people who got these letters. And this isn't going to do anything to help, draw veterans in. I think veterans are very conscious of the fact that they're being tracked very well. Whenever you go to see a doctor now, you're going to be put into a computer system. There's going to be information attached to your name, to your VA claim number, your social security number, whatever it is. And it seemed like after Vietnam, they started these vet centers, and a lot of the veterans went there, and it really helped them. But is there a move towards maybe doing something for Iraq and Afghanistan veterans who want to do things anonymously because they are worried about becoming first responders and things like that?
There are a few community resources available because this is a big problem. And today, vet centers actually fall under the purview of the VA, although it's sort of a separate branch, and there is the same clinical record keeping. But if someone is worried about this, One is the NYU Military Family Clinic. I guess they, because of funding, don't have the same obligations to report to the state, because if you're not using Medicaid or depending on the type of payment source that you're using. So they can keep a very minimal paper trail, and also the Rosen Center with North Shore LIJ. I believe that they're entirely grant funded, so I think you can actually, I don't even think anyone's going to check your ID. You can say you're John Doe. They still have the obligation to keep the clinical records, but it is a big fear that's happening where a lot of people who are, they're not even sure if they have a real problem yet. They're terrified to walk into because suddenly this tag is going to be put onto them, and then the penalty for that diagnosis is going to become more and more severe. Other great programs, Wounded Warriors, they run, it's not counseling, but it's kind of, sort of experiential kind of learning stuff that can really help people through stuff. Being involved in veterans peer support can be a big thing. And it's just something that I'm always very conscious of, working in the clinical world, that, if we do start this paper trail, it can really dramatically affect people's lives. So there are some resources out there for people that are concerned about it. And, we do what we can to try to get the information out through Veteran Circles so people know that there is an alternative, that they can get help and address issues before, someone's forcing them to do it.
Yeah, good afternoon. My name is Thomas Taylor. I'm a United States Navy veteran. I served 12 years, but I didn't do any combat, but I was real close. But my question is that since, I think it was 2006, if I'm correct, 2007, 2008, when the bill passed for the HUD VASH program, I'm not sure if you've heard of it, but they had 2,500 vouchers for veterans that's coming home. I'm involved in that. I received my veterans voucher in February last year, and then I got my partner last year, so I'm coming up on a year of my partner. But my question is that, now that we had the thing with Super Sandy, destroying the VA 23rd Street, so there's nowhere really for the vets that are injured to go, because they want you to go out to Fort Hamilton, and then, they having conflicts about closing veteran hospitals. My thing is maybe we can have little community centers, in each borough, and then they can correspond with the big VA hospital, and that would get more information out to the vets. A lot of vets don't know that when they come home, they can't get a voucher to get their own home. And Judge, I'm not too sure what you, but I've looked on the website for your program. So can I get that application right now? If that's all right with you?
I'm sorry, can you get what?
The application right now, is that all right with you?
Oh, the mentor application. I'll get one to Sarah, and she will definitely get that to you. Thank you.
And just to address some of the resources that are available to people while Harbor Healthcare is closed, there is still a vet center in every borough. They can generally see any information that is put in through the regular VA, but the VA cannot see information they enter without a release of information. If you sign it, they will happily coordinate with any VA hospital. If you go down to Harbor Healthcare, they are running regular buses to the Bronx VA. You will have to go through the eligibility office again, but I mean, it's a 5-minute process. They have it done quick. And there's also community providers. But if anyone has any questions, on the VA's website, there is a great page of all the resources and all the places you can go. You can find out where your doctor is and tell us.
Hi everyone, my name is Carolina Vasquez. I served 5 years active duty in the Navy. I'm also the president of the Veteran Association here at John Jay. So my question is to the judge. I wanted to know, I know that you're a civilian, so I kind of wanted to know what inspired you to get involved with veterans. And aside from that, also when you were talking in reference to support services, I think, your support services is something great. And I feel like maybe if there was a way that we could bridge the gap between the 1% that have served active duty in the military between civilians, so that way we can offer more support services to veterans. So, thank you.
So your question essentially is, how did I get interested in having a veterans court?
Right, and maybe some suggestions as to how we can bridge the gap between veterans coming back, veterans that are here, and civilians, just to have them more involved and as an alliance.
I think we need more of a PR campaign as far as having civilians realize a lot of the issues that you were speaking about earlier, Colin was speaking about earlier today. My dad is a Korean War vet. All of my uncles are World War II vets. We actually my team applied for a training grant from NDCI, the National Drug for Institute, and we were trained in Buffalo. We received that grant, and all 10 members of my team went up to Buffalo for a week and observed Judge Russell's court, the first Veterans Court, and got trained in everything we needed to know. But I had veterans in all my courts before I opened a Veterans Court. I was very aware of the problems that they were experiencing. And I had veterans who were in drug court, I had veterans who were in mental health court, and I had veterans in my DWI court. It just seemed like a natural thing to do, to just move them all into one court. And that's what we did, and then we started to get additional members as well. But my Veterans Court is open. We mix the cases some days with other parts, and I think that the defense bar and the other citizens who come to our courts and see the work that we do, I think are more cognizant of the issues and are definitely more aware of the problems that vets are handling. But I think like the Robin Hood Foundation and a lot of the other foundations that you mentioned as well, Colin, are getting the message out there. And I think we still need to get more, we need to do more work in that area. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Welby Alcantara. I'm the Veterans Affairs Coordinator here at John Jay. I used to work at City for about 5 years, and I'm an 8-year veteran of the United States Marine Corps. I'm a 10-year veteran of the VA health system. And sometimes in my personal experience going to the VA, if my primary doctor is not there because she works at NYU Hospital, they would say, go to the free clinic, which is really a clinic where you wait 3 hours in the VA hospital. And every time I go there and I explain to them what my problem is, even though it is in the computer, and even though I've been going there for 10 years or so, they always say, okay, what medication do you want?
Exactly.
And I think about it sometimes, and I say, okay, I could ask for something really crazy and get addicted to it, and probably lose my house and all my property, or I could say, I don't want any medication, I want something local, and just to deal with the pain, and I'll make an appointment with my general doctor. With situations like that, and I know a lot of my veterans tell me, hey, I could get this, they offer me this, and sometimes I hear the medicine cabinet in their bags. And do you see or foresee in the future the laws changing? Because I would say in my time I've met about 25 to 50 veterans that became addicted to drugs due to the VA.
That's a big problem. The Attorney General, Eric Schneiderman here, has really jumped on the forefront of that problem, especially when you had the situation out in Melville with the very addicted veteran who on Father's Day went in and killed the 4 people in the pharmacy. So when you get more of those horrible page 1 stories, people start to take notice, sadly. So there's new legislation pending, and there have been some laws that have passed with respect to the registries and people being able to fill prescriptions and multiple prescriptions. It's a huge problem nationwide right now, and you're going to be seeing more on that over the next couple of years because Congress may tackle that issue on a national level. I don't think it's good that some of the states are involved right now, but when people can then just go state to state, that's not going to help anything either. So I think you need better laws, better national laws with respect to the medications, and I think we have to start steering people to more non-narcotic pain relief. That's what we do in my court. We try to steer them to alternatives.
If I can just add, I think part of the things that I've observed, so the issue with medication has to be addressed by laws and changes. When my dad had cancer, getting his pain medicine was far harder. I mean, like what you go through to get the medicine is far harder than walking this is end of life stages, but walking into a pharmacy or at the VA and telling them what you want. One of the issues I think is that there's still so many people that believe things like PTSD will never go away. That this is chronic, this is lifetime, and just medication or whatever people find helpful, just give it to them. And so I mean, even at the VA, the education with the physicians that PTSD is treatable. We've seen long-term decreases in diagnosis and symptoms with effective treatments, but I think there's still people who operate with the sense of it's never going away, it's chronic, PTSD, and then the medical concerns, let's just feed it with medications. And that's part of the concern. I think we have to deal with the stigma and the larger picture.
I think also trained clinicians is another issue. A lot of times they're using short-term medications for long-term problems. One of the things we see at our clinic over and over again is benzodiazepine addiction, which people are being treated for post-traumatic stress disorder. It's an anti-anxiety medication, but it was meant to stabilize people, not for long-term treatment, and it's horribly addicting. So, clinicians, I think, need to be much more cautious, as the doctors, as far as what they're prescribing and tracking it better is another factor in it.
So the judge has to actually go have a calendar this afternoon with some of her participants, so she had to leave. So thank you, Judge. Nobody has this room reserved for the next few minutes, so if there are more questions, I mean, it's a smaller group now. There's students that had to leave for classes and so on. But if you do have a question, by all means, please do, and grab something to eat, or chat with each other. But please, if you have another question, go ahead.
There's a question.
Yes. Good afternoon. My name is Joan Hadjar. I'd like to thank everyone. I'd like to especially thank Colin for guiding me and coaching me. I'm the director for Phoenix House AmeriCorps, where we've submitted a new RFP to target and focus our performance measures solely on veterans and their families and their needs. And while you have an abundance of students that will need interns, I'll leave my card here. We do have paid interns and education money. They receive $5,550 education money to further their education. And I need to learn as much as I can in order to help and do the best job possible. So this was a perfect opportunity for me to hear professionals like yourself and the comments around the room and stuff. I want to commend you all for the work that you do. Thank you.